Thank you everyone for coming this evening to the Warwick Sustainability Summit 2021, joining the Coventry and Warwickshire Green Week. Put you on all on mute for now, and I'll unmute you for those with questions when we get to the Q&A. If you do have any questions during the event for our speakers, then do please put them in the chat box. We are recording the event, and the event is also hopefully being live streamed via the Sustainability at Warwick Facebook page at Warwick Unisust. We're all aware that the last 12 months have been difficult, and even more so in regions of the world dealing with both natural disasters caused by climate change and COVID-19 at the same time. These months have given us time to look at the state of the world around us and given us time to process the trouble that we are in, and in many cases resolve to turn things around. As Hopi will mention later this evening, COP26 is being held in Glasgow in November, and it will be the most important event of our lifetime. Time is running out, but these past few months have given us a renewed hope. The EU and China have set new carbon emission targets, and the USA has rejoined the COP21 Paris Agreement. New technologies are surged forward, and so many people have woken up and are facing these challenges head on. And it is with that positivity that we look upon tonight. So let me introduce our first speaker, who is Christine Ennew. Chris is the Provost at the University of Warwick, where she supports the Vice-Chancellor in the academic leadership of the university. A key aspect of her role is to lead the development and delivery of the university's academic strategy, ensuring that Warwick remains competitive and relevant within HE and beyond. She's responsible for the efficient and effective use of academic resources. In addition, she is the chair of the university's Social Inclusion Committee and is the executive board lead for the university environmental sustainability strategy and implementation. Christine graduated from Cambridge University, completed a PhD in Nottingham. She was also previously one of Nottingham's Pro Vice Chancellors and served as Provost and CEO at the University of Nottingham's Malaysia campus. She joined the University of Warwick in August 2016, and she's currently a member of the Board of Directors for Common Purpose Student Experiences. She is also a member of the Higher Education Funding Council for Wales and the chair of its Regulation Committee. So over to you, Chris.
Thanks, David. Thanks for that very, very elaborate introduction. Very much appreciated. And just to say, it's a real pleasure to be here today. I hope I am succeeding in sharing my screen. And you will tell me if I have succeeded or failed, David?
I believe something's coming through.
Something's coming through. That's always a good start. So what I wanted to do, I mean, I've got about 15 minutes. I'm really pleased that I could join you today. And one of the things that's always positive about these sorts of events is that we're actually participating in a way that really does have a positive impact on our own carbon footprints. And that's one of those things that's happened as a consequence of the pandemic. And I think it's one of the things that's really important that we do continue in terms of the way we use technology. What I'm going to try and do is say a bit about how we are approaching the challenge of environmental sustainability and how we're trying to substantively reduce the negative and enhance the positive impacts that we have in relation to a global climate crisis. And I would say that I think many of our most immediate impacts come from our own operations as an organisation. But I firmly believe that actually it's our teaching and our research that will have the real long-term and sustained, magnified impact. It's that work that's really going to make a difference for the longer term. So what I'm going to try and cover here is, sorry, I'm having, yeah, okay, got it. So I want to say something about our climate emergency commitment and the 5 pathways, particularly the role that we've ascribed to the SDGs. something about our guiding principles, the way in which we're going to try and embed this in planning, and some examples of the work that we do. So our response to the climate emergency. We've identified essentially 5 pathways for that response. And I'll say a little bit about those in a minute. I think one of the key messages that I'd like to give is that actually we've been working on sustainability. We've been working on managing our climate emissions for quite some time. It was work that was reflected in things like the Green Metrics rankings. We've been particularly dependent on colleagues from estates to progress this work. And you'll see, and perhaps some of you will be aware of this, we've invested quite heavily in self-generation. We've installed PV cells. We currently self-generate about 50% of our electricity, not all from PV, by the way. We're moving towards purchase of wholly green electricity this year. We've done some fantastic research around battery storage, electric vehicles, and we offer a range of programs on global sustainable development. So I don't think we've ever had a lack of commitment to trying to change things, but we were, I think it's fair to say, not terribly coordinated, not terribly strategic. And in 2019, all of that changed, because like so many other universities, that was the point at which we made our climate commitment. And when we articulated our targets for 2030 and 2050, and you'll see those on the slide. We're working on those, not just sequentially, but in parallel. And what that means is that while we're working towards looking at buildings, energy systems and smart controls to try and get us towards net zero from scope 1 and 2. At the same time, we're looking at carbon saving actions in procurement, in mobility, in buildings, and we're looking at our education offer. Key to all of this, I think, is the UN SDGs, and I'll say a little bit more about those in a minute. But part and parcel of that is, I think, a recognition that we need to get much more sustainability embedded into our curriculum. And we need to continue to work quite significantly on the biodiversity of our campus and on the cultural and behavioural changes of members in our community, broadly defined. So let me say something about the role that we have for the SDGs. In many senses, we've adopted the SDGs as the overarching framework for all of the work we do under that broad heading of sustainability. And we've drawn heavily on leadership from our director of the, well, not just the director, but all of the members of our Institute for Global Sustainable Development. We've established an SDG advisory group that works closely with our Environmental and Social Sustainability Advisory Group. We've signed up, last year we signed up for the first time to the UN's SDG Accord, and for the first time we reported our activity against the SDGs. And I'm sure somebody will point out the web address for that report, but it was looking at how we were able to use our research, our education, our operations to try and make a difference in each of those key areas. And that reporting allowed us to track what we do, to explore where we can do more to make a difference, but also it's allowed us to really try and promote awareness of activity in this area. And somebody's helpfully put that in the chat, so that's great. We have put in place something that we've called our Environment and Social Sustainability Action Group. This follows on from the Climate Emergency Task Force that we created to coordinate our initial responses to the Climate Emergency Declaration. This has a role in guiding, in supporting, in driving and in coordinating change and helping us to identify the underlying pathways that we need to follow to get to the targets that we set out in our climate emergency declaration. It's identified a range of guiding principles, and I'd like to just say a little bit about those. So, it's the recognition, broadly, we need to think about both behavioural and technical responses. We need to get sustainability seen as the norm. It's something that must make sense for us as individuals, for us as an institution. And that means it's got to make good organisational and business sense. It's got to be viable as a long-term approach to how we work. And it must become embedded. And that's why it's so important that we can work across our community, but also that we work through our education offer to inspire as many people as we can to see this as a fundamental part of what they do. It's really important that we have this global citizenship attitude, that we recognise that we all have a role to play. And that has to mean that we don't just talk about it, we do it. And we increasingly are trying to see our campus as a living laboratory. It's where we can test, we can learn, we can action, we can do things, we can try things out, we can see what works, we can adapt and we can change, and we can demonstrate how to really make a difference. And that means that, of course, communication and support is hugely important. So we've got to raise awareness within and around our immediate community. But we've got to show what we can do to incentivise, to encourage change, to encourage a reduced impact. And we need to ensure that we've got policy and practice that will reduce and make efficient use of natural resources. And that's going to be across what we do. And we need to move thinking away from thinking about what's cheap and convenient to what's smart, efficient, agile, and underpinned by notions of recycling and reuse. And we need ultimately to make sure we are responsible and accountable for what we do to our community, both on campus and beyond. And that's the region, but it's actually much broader than that. We're starting to work to try and embed these ideas into our planning and operations, taking the actions that we want to develop at an aggregate level, working out how we can feed those through into different programs of activities, how we can engage departments, the different units that form the university, to follow up on those actions, and then to reflect change in our annual sustainability statement and use that then to drive further activity through the planning process. What I'd like to then do, I think, is take you on just to say a little bit about some of the initiatives that many of you may be familiar with, some of you won't, but some of the things that have started and are in place, and some of the changes that we've got planned. So many of you will be familiar with the network of Green Champions, who, as far as that planning process is concerned, have a really important role to play in driving change at departmental level and promoting some of that engagement that we really need to ensure that what we do translates into action at local levels. We've got most departments covered. We've got 260 plus Green Champions on the staff side, many more on the student side, a larger population, and we're building green action teams to drive change across the staff community. We've got our ESAG coordinating and overseeing the 5 different pathways that we've identified. There's a lot of information on here. I'm not going to go through it all, but what it does is it highlights our ability to identify the key areas where we know we need to drive change. So we know that if we look across scopes 1, 2 and 3, mobility is a massive source of carbon emissions. And we've got a big sustainable transport strategy in place, change travel policy. Energy we've kind of touched on a little bit, but decarbonisation is key there. And I should also mention buildings, because again, our buildings, our construction activity is a big source of emissions. And one of the most recent developments, our new IBRB, Interdisciplinary Biomedical Research Building, is a great case in point, because by using different approaches to construction, we were able to reduce by, I think, something like 80% the number of visits to campus to bring deliveries. So off-site construction, reduced on-site impacts, and novel construction methods using particularly glulam timber meant we could have a very significantly reduced level of carbon emissions in that building. So that was a kind of a sign of the way forward. There's a whole series of other activities going on there around IT policy, around cold storage, around food strategy, around waste and recycling, and around our printing arrangements. Some further examples. We have close to 3,000 solar PV cells across campus, with lots more on the way. We were bidding into the Salix Fund for a major investment in solar and ground source heat pumps. We passed the technical specs. We didn't get the money this time. We'll keep going on that one. And the internal carbon tax is part of our new travel policy. It's something that we will be using to support investments on campus to reduce our emissions. On the biodiversity side, lots happening on campus, but also perhaps highlight the Arden Farm Wildlife Network, which is something that we're closely involved with. A range of projects there, both around trees and bird life, to really try and provide improved environments to support a range of birds. And to improve habitats through trees and hedgerows. I've got a big list of projects on campus. I'm not going to go through all of those because I'm running out of time. But again, lots happening, bringing together the university and the student community, working across energy, across water, across the SDGs, across a range of welfare activities, bringing more students into sustainability-focused societies. And of course, with the coming year, we'll have a range of new activities to talk about and update you on in due course. Now, conscious, as I say, that I am now probably out of time. So I think at this point, I'm just going to close. I hope I've given you a flavour of the work that we're doing. We're just about to launch a major policy statement about how we will work towards those 2030 and 2050 targets. And if you look out for that, that's going to come later this year. And I look forward to discussing further when we get to Q&A. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. Lots and lots being done on the campus at the moment, and I look forward to seeing what we've got in store over the next few months and years. Our next speaker is Mathilde Roberts, who has worked in the environment industry for more than 10 years, graduated with a master's degree in environmental services and a master's degree in business and finance as well. Mathilde has a wide range of international experiences in public, private and charity sector, from strategic to operational level, including Veolia, Greater Paris City Council, Action 21 in Leamington and Warwickshire Council. Mathilde's current role is the Waste and Recycling Manager at the University of Warwick, and her focus is to turn waste into resources, deliver efficient, compliant and sustainable service for the benefit of the university, community and the environment. So over to you, Mathilde.
Thanks, David. I'm very glad to be here today and to have the opportunity to speak to you. And it's great to see more and more people willing to take part into the sustainability agenda. When I was studying about 20 years ago, and now my master degree in finance and corporate social responsibility, that was a new concept, a new word, and sustainability was not really part of the day-to-day life. So it's really good to see that in 20 years, things have really, really evolved. But still, we are facing this massive challenge to turn an aspiration into an action plan and to how to make a real impact on the ground. So what I'm going to present today is the waste and recycling strategy to give an example of a list of action, a strategy and a list of action that we hope will make an impact on the campus, on the community, and on the carbon footprint eventually. So I will start with a little bit of wider context. What is waste management at the University of Warwick? As you know, we have 26,000 students, 7,000 students living on campus. So it's the size of a little town. This little town generates 3,300 tons of waste. That is about 6,000 elephants to remove out of campus on a yearly basis. So we use vehicle, compactor, staff who collects bags of rubbish, but it's not general waste and mixed recycling that we have to remove. It's 137 different type of waste stream: paint, lamps, neon, hazardous waste. There's a wide range of things to dispose of, and each waste stream needs to be disposed of in a specific way. So all this has an environmental impact and also a budget impact. We have the wider context has really changed over the last 30 years. If we look back before 1990, all we wanted to do with waste was to just get rid of them because it was an obvious hygiene problem, and we didn't want to spend too much money and avoid any health and safety issue with that. But in 1990, there was a new piece of regulation called the duty of care, where every producer of waste was responsible for removing its waste and disposing of it in an appropriate environmental way. And not only they have to do that, but also they have to demonstrate this compliance. So from that date, it really became a big environmental compliant exercise. In 2000, the waste strategy was introduced with the waste hierarchy and the recycling targets. So from this point, things starting to move into transform waste into resources. But now in 2020, we are really in the sustainability age, and this waste management become part of the core business of the organization. Organization needs to manage their resources in a sustainable way, and they need to make sure that this is implemented on the ground. So out of this context, the University of Warwick has set 3 key objectives. The first one still is to keep the campus clean and safe and to continually improve the way we operate to remove those 3,000 tons of waste. The second objective is to sustainability turn waste into resources and to implement this waste hierarchy that I mentioned to reduce, reuse, recycle, recover. And the third key item is to ensure and demonstrate compliance and to develop a robust process of reporting. Some example of these key objectives and how we implement that on the ground. On the first item, to reduce waste, at the end of term, as you can imagine, when 7,000 students leave the campus with a lot of international students, we are left with some items, food, pots, pans, clothes, that the students can't take with them. And we have been working with local charities, and especially one, Emmaus, who is supporting local homeless people and provide them with a shelter, a work to go back into a track in their life. So we have been working with them over the summer, giving them hundreds and hundreds of containers of donation. They have been able to come back on campus at the beginning of the term to sell second-hand items to the new batch of students, and they have raised £3,000 of donation for the charity. So that was really a great action, a great way to avoid waste, to reuse items, and to support local community and the student at the same time. So that was really good to see. If it's good to see this kind of action, I will stress the point that in the first place, the best waste is the one that we don't produce at all. So we are also working with David on some programs to reduce waste at source and to find some solution not to generate waste in the first place. Some other example of action, some duvet here that have been donated to a charity. Another one that I really like is the coffee grounds composting. As you can imagine, with lots of cafe, restaurants, and bar on campus, there's a lot of coffee grounds that are generated, and they are now reused on site by our grounds and garden team to generate compost for growing our flowers. So that's a great example of circular economy, a very closed loop all on campus. So it's good to see. We are also segregating out lots of cardboard now and have some dedicated collection for those with the amount of Amazon parcels that are delivered on campus at the minute. It's really good to know that is being recycled appropriately. And last example here is the cables, all the old kettles, and small electrical. We now segregate out the cables made of copper to generate 3,000 pounds a ton of income. So a few examples of simple things that we can do on site to reduce the environmental impact. I'm moving on now to another project. This one is a kind of a bigger project with probably more impact on campus. At the minute on campus, we have 3 types of customers: the accommodation, residences customer, I would say, then the department, and then the cafe, the restaurant, the sports center. On the residences side, the students' accommodation, we have about 1/3 of the waste generated, and we have quite a lot of challenges with the waste being collected in bags, with a recycling rate that is not very high at the minute, and we've also some logistic and carbon footprint issues because of the size of the bins. We have to collect the outside bins about twice a day. You wouldn't expect your local council to collect your external bin twice a day. So we have been looking at alternative solution, and we came up with this proposal that is being rolled out at the minute at Sherborne. So at the minute, you have some internal refuse room, what we call refuse room, where the students can drop their bags, and we also have sometimes some bunker bins. The problem with that is when a sharp object, a knife, a tin lid is placed into the bag, that creates a real problem for the waste assistant in charge of collecting the bags. It also creates all sorts of problems to load the bags into a vehicle and load them into a compactor. Then the compactor is taken to the recycling center or the incinerator to create energy, but then it needs to be returned. So it's not very efficient in terms of carbon footprint. What we're going to do is we're going to install this recycling enclosure. Inside this recycling enclosure, we will have some container, and the container will be collected by a larger vehicle. So it's going to be quite straightforward. The impact of that is that it's going to be much more hygienic for the students because it will be much more clean and easy to segregate out the different waste stream. It's going to be easily accessible because it will be less than 30 meters away from each building, and the standard of the standard will be maintained with the university staff keeping an eye on them and getting them clean and tidy all the time. The other advantage in terms of recycling is that at the minute we have only 2 waste streams to go in the external bin, the general waste and the mixed recycling, and the students have to walk quite a distance to find a glass bank. We will have a glass waste stream integrated here. Also the option to have a food waste waste stream installed, plus a donation to charity container all the time within those enclosures. In addition to that, each container will have a chip inside it. So each time the container will be collected, we will know exactly the weight of recycling into the bin, and we will be able to report back to the students on their percentage of recycling. So it will, we hope, really drive behavior, because when we know that we have achieved 20, 30, 40, 50% of recycling, it really drives behavior. So it's what we intend to do once it's installed. In terms of carbon footprint, I mentioned we're going to reduce by 2 the carbon emission and improve the health and safety for staff and students. To support that, because it's a big behavioral change, we plan to have a communication campaign. This is not exactly the communication campaign, it's just an example of fun and gaming communication campaign that has been launched in London, the most wanted packaging to go into the bin. Quite like it, so it might look like that when we launch our communication campaign. Yeah, that's it. That was an example of action plan that will hopefully make a change and transform our aspiration into an action. That's it.
Thank you, Mathilde. There's so much work happening there, and it's good to see we're tackling the waste side of it so well. But as Mathilde said, we really need to tackle the consumption side of things with regards to everything, and that's one of the ways that we're going to, as a society, tackle climate change, is reducing our consumption. So next we have Hopi Sen. Hopi was is a policy advisor at WMG, University of Warwick. After an earlier career that took in brand management of popular washing powders and working in Parliament, Hopi joined the WMG team to work on policy agenda around the industrial strategy, sustainability and skills. In that role, he worked to support WMG's leadership, first under Lord Bhattacharya and now with Margaret James, in sharing their vision for applied research and education, which helps businesses, students and society innovate, grow and prepare for the challenges of a connected, decarbonised society. So over to you, Hopi.
Thank you. Is my mic and everything working?
It is indeed.
Great. And David, will you give me a 2-minute warning when I need to be quiet?
I will, yeah.
I think the first. Thank you. I think the first thing I take from the first two presentations is how sustainability is an enormous topic, and it's so huge and all-encompassing, covering everything from biodiversity to education to construction to supply chains to waste management, reuse and recycling. And that can make it a little bit of an intimidating topic, especially when you start stepping back from the specific actions you have control over to the great big global policy debates. And I think that's really highlighted in what David was saying earlier about how important COP26 is, and then how we can think about how we contribute to that. So what I want to do today is talk a bit about COP26, what it is and what it's all about, and then take really from the big to the small and specific about what kind of things just one part of Warwick WMG is doing to contribute to one theme, one part of COP26. So what is COP26? Well, its formal name is the 26th UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties, COP26, and it's a global forum for nations to agree the targets they'll set to reduce carbon emissions in the end to reach net zero. It's the international community's primary means of negotiating on and agreeing the global response to the threat of climate change. And as Alok Sharma, the COP26 president, says, it should be, or is intended to be, a moment where the world comes together to ramp up momentum towards a climate resilient zero carbon economy. And it's happening this November in Glasgow. It follows on from the Paris Agreement, as David mentioned earlier, which is also known as COP21, which was really the first time 5 years ago when nations set firm targets. And COP26 is important because it's the first time since the implementation of the Paris Agreement that that the nations have a chance to update their targets and set more aggressive targets. So the aim is that it's a combination of nation states, civil society, firm targets, leading to real progress to stop climate change. So how are we doing? Well, ahead of COP26, every nation is supposed to set out how will it make progress in reducing carbon emissions by 2030. Some nations have done that. The EU has proposed a 55% cut versus 1990 emissions. The UK has proposed 68% cut versus 1990 emissions. Obviously, for more developing countries, that's a different challenge because of the nature of the economic growth. So Mexico has proposed a 76% increase of carbon emissions by 2030 versus 1990. And for perspective, a good way to think about it, because these are quite confusing numbers, is that cutting 100% of 1990 emissions is what's needed to reach net zero by 2050. It's not quite true, because some of the emissions, things like aerospace and shipping, who the debate over who gets the blame for the emission is a live one. But it's a good shorthand in the medium term. And in terms of the commitments that nations have made, only 49 countries plus the EU have submitted new commitments on emissions since Paris. 113 have not. And of those that have made commitments, not all of those have increased or improved their Paris commitments. And you can see a chart here that just shows the scale of the issue, that the countries in green have gone a step further, said they'll go further than they did in Paris. Those in red have said they'll stay the same. And those in grey or blue have basically said, well, we're going to wait and see. We're not committed to anything as yet. And of course, targets aren't everything. It's all very well to set a target, but how do you get there? And that's why the themes of COP26 come in. And the UN and the UK and Italy have set 5 themes, and then they've added an extra one for COP26 debates and discussions. Those are clean transport. How do we achieve net zero mobility in road, rail, freight and air? Nature-based solutions. Actions that protect, manage and restore ecosystems to address social challenges like climate change. Adaptation and resilience, improving the ability of natural and human systems to respond to climate change, or after they've occurred, which is adaptation, or improving their inherent ability to absorb and withstand climate change, which is resilience. 4th one is clean energy. How do we create the sustainable, renewable, zero carbon energy production, transmission and consumption that is needed? And then underpinning those is green finance. How do we make sure that there's funding in place to do all of these things, to make the changes that we need? In addition to that, for COP26 exhibition in Glasgow, there's also going to be emphasis on buildings and urban renewal, what cities and towns have to do. And that obviously is important for us because, as was said earlier, Warwick campus is effectively a small town, so we can be an exemplar for the kind of changes that we want to see. So each of one of those questions has huge implications. It can be quite intimidating thinking about how do you even begin to tackle this? How do you begin to contribute to the process? Just on our campus, you can look on everything from emissions, building standards, renewables, micromobility, waste, awareness, campaigning, and all of those things are absolutely essential. As Chris said, work is being done on all of those areas to hit our own targets, and those apply well beyond our campus. So I wanted to highlight today just some of the work being done in just one part of Warwick at WMG to address just one theme of COP26, which we believe will make a difference to how we get where we need to go. And that's WMG's contribution to clean transport. So as you may know, the UK has set a 2030 target for the end of petrol and diesel engine sales. In practice, that's being brought forward 3 years to 2027 by the deal that we reached with the EU on rules of origin about where battery manufacturing is going to happen. So there's a huge need to support the shift to electrification, and it encompasses a lot more than just electric cars. I should stress I'm not an expert in any of these fields. It's the hundreds of talented engineers, researchers, educators, and students who are working on these issues that are making the difference. So I'll simplify and botch their brilliant work horribly, and I hope any of them listening will forgive me. To start off with, at our Energy Innovation Centre, we're researching new battery technology. How do you improve the performance of batteries? New types of batteries like solid state. How do you move beyond the dependence on unsustainable materials like lithium, copper? And the reuse and recycling of batteries so that once they've finished being used in transport, they can be used to power homes and power offices. Secondly, if we're going to need to build electric vehicles, we're going to need building electric motors. So HVEMS is a project of looking at how do you build the electric motors at scale, working with industry to find out what the challenges are of actually building massive numbers of electric motors at a level we've never seen before. But mobility needs to be a lot more than engines and cars. For example, if you want to make an electric vehicle effective, you have to make it as light as possible. So in Project Tucana, we're working with industry to replace steel and aluminium with composites that are lighter, meaning vehicles can travel further on the same battery charge using less carbon. And then in areas like we also need to look at new transport systems. So it's not enough to just move people over to from existing petrol and diesel cars to electric cars. You also have to change the whole system of transport, the way people move. So we're looking at things like very light rail, project in Coventry to introduce battery-powered public transport in a lightweight form that is autonomous and can just operate by itself, switching people over from individual transport to mass transit. And then there's niche vehicles, e-cargo bikes, electric construction machines, e-scooters. All of these need to be reflected. But even then, it's not just about research. It's about taking it out into the world. So a big part of our mission for COP26 is about how we take the research and the ideas and the talent that we've got here and take it into the world and make sure it makes a difference, has an impact. So in skills, for example, our degree apprenticeship course and our degrees are embedding sustainability into their courses so that engineers of the future will learn sustainable principles from the ground up. They will learn about how to become electric engineers, lightweight engineers, sustainable resource engineers, reuse and recycling engineers. We're partners in the UK Battery Industrialisation Centre, which is, as we develop the kind of new batteries of the future, the new high intensity, high efficiency, long life batteries that we need, there's a question of how you manufacture those. How do you turn those from being ideas in a lab to being put into use into the marketplace? So that's happening over in Coventry. In Midlands Future Mobility, we're researching how autonomy and connection can reduce the demand for energy. So, moving people, instead of taking a commute, how do you move people from their house to a transport hub, then to a mass transit, and then away to their office or workplace? It's about taking it out into the community. So whether in skills and sustainability courses embedded in apprenticeships and degrees, making sure that we reach out to industry to help them industrialize batteries, how we get them to transition into the marketplace, how we work with communities to test new public transport systems, multimodal hubs so that people can move from home to office without using private transport, and also how we reach out into schools and to communities to inspire the next generation of engineers, especially those from excluded communities, because there's a huge store of talent out there that we're not currently using to take advantage and to work on all of these issues. So this is just a small selection of ways we're working on these issues, and which one itself, as I said, is just one element of the wider need for sustainability, which Mathilde and Chris addressed earlier. But each element is needed, each element is important, and across 2021, ahead of and during COP26, I think all of us at Warwick, all of us at WMG want to highlight why this work is important, how it can make a difference, and why it's important to support these initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Hopi. That was incredible. It's fantastic to see the vast array of research that we do on campus and that does get spread out into the wider world to make a difference. Next up, we've got Hannah Micuta. She is a second year GSD and Life Sciences student at the University of Warwick. She's organised talks on waste, co-created a play on environmental degradation, and was recently elected to be Warwick Students' Union's next Environmental and Ethics Officer. So welcome to Hannah.
Hi, can you see me okay?
We can now, yes.
Brilliant. Okay, cool. Thank you. So I firstly just wanted to say thank you to David for inviting me to talk at the summit today. As David just pointed out, I was recently elected to be the Environment Ethics Officer, which I feel really honoured to have been chosen for. But what does this role mean? it's kind of broad and kind of vague, like environment and ethics. So building on the concept of sustainability that we've discussed in the talk so far, I thought I'd go right back to the start and track how my understanding of sustainability has changed over time and what this means for my activities as the EEO going forward. Within 10 minutes, so I'll try and keep it snappy. My first memories of environmentalism were very much focused on individual actions. I remember reading in magazines of people that I liked at the time, always turning off switches, and I was like, that's me, that's me. And we'd have talks at school about recycling, don't waste water. I was involved in all the sustainability groups, even when no one else in the upper years of my primary school wanted to join. I would be there collecting bags of clothes donations in the school car park. I'd be dragging my friends to come help me with recycling activities with the younger years. At secondary school, I'd actually got this reputation for taking paper out of the recycling bins for my revision notes. I'd use pencils right down to the nub. And by this point, my endeavour to switch off lights was really starting to get on my parents' nerves. It was around this time that I got into blogging and gave presentations on climate change at school. And whilst I could see that many people around me were keen to engage, I'd get frustrated at the lack of action around me. I'd sometimes get praise for a motivating speech, but then nothing. Nevertheless, I still felt quite protected from it all, distant. Climate change was something for the top leaders in the government to deal with, and they all said that they were dealing with it. So I'd watch Blue Planet and be like, yeah, we're doing something now, right? I can't persuade my parents to buy solar panels, but I'll just keep working and soon I'll actually be able to be in a position to help. It wasn't until I was in my last couple of years at school that we started to talk sustainability, the interconnected nature of it all, the social, the economic, and of course the environmental. How often communities would strive for one aspect of this at the cost of another. That there were places like Medellin in Colombia and initiatives like urban agriculture in Detroit that enabled people to make lasting positive changes. I was fascinated by these cases, watched TED Talk after TED Talk after TED Talk, and thought, if we can just learn from these examples, we'll be okay. I was hopeful. And I came to study GSD, and that was a big learning curve. We learned about the tragedy of the commons and Malthus, systemic racism, the importance of intersectionality and addressing environmental injustice, power of lobbyists, money, the terror of big pharma. We had fake news, populism and walls, the climate crisis, the mental health crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the crisis of capitalism, racial capitalism, modern genocide, and then to top it all off, the ability to hide behind an unachieved goal or rephrase it to make your failure sound a success. You could call coming to Warwick a sort of epiphany for me, but that sounds a bit pretentious. And not that I hadn't come across all this stuff before, but finally they all came together under this neat little term, sustainability, or unsustainability for that matter. I realized that I'd been naive. I realized that so much of the time I'd thought of environmental issues as separate to others, as issues only for the big guns to address. At school, we focused on topics of recycling and plastic, the tangible and the close. And in so doing, we forgot about the ethical. Climate colonialism was hidden from the mainstream narrative. We needed to tackle centuries of oppression towards marginalized groups, but this was buried in rhetoric. We forgot that we are a part of Gaia, just one tiny component of a beautiful interconnected web of beings keeping each other alive. And I find that beautiful, but it was forgotten. If we're to tackle these crises, we must address all of them, or at least acknowledge them. And that is a pretty big ask. It can feel quite oppressive at times, and I sometimes feel like I just want to run away from it all. I'm sure I'm not alone in that. Though I'm sure that also what I feel is nothing compared to what many other people experience. But I am still hopeful. Some of you may still think that I'm naive. perhaps in some ways I still am. But when I see peaceful protests and activism and civil disobedience growing on campus and around the world, I've no reason but to be hopeful in the power of the collective to reverse the course that we're heading in. And especially when we organise talks like this summit. So how am I going to take this forward into my role as EEO? Well, the number one thing for me is making sure that I represent the student voice. I know I come with my own biases and things, so I'll be creating some supportive roles for individuals of BAME, LGBTQ and low-income backgrounds to critique my plans. And building off this year's Green Week, I'll continue the conversation on climate colonialism and highlight stories from activists from all backgrounds, showcasing the small acts and the radical leaders that often get marginalised from the mainstream narrative. I want to create the environment that's enabling for students. And if you've read my manifesto, I wouldn't go into much detail, but just that I'll also be pushing for more acceptable and affordable vegetarian and vegan food options. And it's great to see that the food waste bins will hopefully be making a comeback on campus. So I'm excited to keep pushing for that. I'll demand an end to single-use packaging and bioplastics in SU food outlets. Investigate opportunities for rewilding on campus and using ethical suppliers for things like cleaning products. And then last but by no means least, ensuring that the university stays on track to achieve its carbon neutrality goal for 2030 and 2050 at the latest. I say at the latest because we must not let this sort of abstract goal slacken our efforts. Climate change is here and now, already being experienced by so many communities around the globe, particularly in the global south. So my plan is to work with the uni to break the goal down into annual targets for each year up until the 2030 and 2050 mark, so that we can make sure that we meet each one by each year, so that when my time is up at EEO, that I'll still be able to know if we've achieved anything. But then also just to accelerate any action wherever possible. Hopefully breaking this down will make this clear. I will continue urging for fossil fuel divestment, and I'd like to take this opportunity to ask Chris Ennew if we could please have student representation on the university's investment committee, and for the university's annual investments to be made publicly available. Tackling these crises requires collective action, and I believe that we can work together on this. I'm super excited to do so. And so, yes, I do remain hopeful. Thank you very much for listening. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Hannah. That was a wonderful speech. It is incredibly important for everybody to work together, no matter where we are in the world. And I think over the last 12 months, we've truly realised just how quickly we can connect with each other and talk to each other via online platforms. I understand that a lot of people might be zoomed out, but hopefully this is something that we will be able to integrate into our future plans. Next, we have Kate Orr, who is currently in her second year studying history at Warwick. She's part of the executive team at Warwick and that have founded STAR, which is an incredible society in raising awareness for the refugee cause. The refugee cause is something that she's extremely passionate about, especially campaigning for and giving voices to those who are oppressed and fleeing persecution. So if I can pass over to Kate now, please.
Yeah, of course. Hi, my name's Kate, and I'm part of the exec of STAR. Today I will be talking about what STAR is, what we do as a society at Warwick, and the sustainability implications of the work that we do. So I'm sure some people have heard of STAR before, But STAR stands for Student Action for Refugees. It's a national charity of 34,000 students. It has 3 principal aims, which is 1, educate people about refugees and asylum seekers, 2, volunteer at local refugee projects, and 3, campaign to improve the lives of refugees. STAR is made up of 50 groups at universities and colleges across the UK and a national team which coordinates and supports the groups. STAR Warwick is one of the largest charities on campus and does a lot of brilliant work within our university community and beyond, which I think is quite niche to STAR, that we're going beyond the borders of the university grounds. As a society, we organise volunteering opportunities among members, such as our Conversation Cafe, which helps refugees and asylum seekers learn English. And also we work with organisations such as My Friendly Cities and Share My Language in Coventry to empower and share cultures between refugees and asylum seekers and the volunteers who take part in these volunteering schemes. Within STAR, we support a lot of campaigns and encourage those involved, as well as those who aren't involved in STAR but just within the university field, to sign these petitions and get involved where possible to raise awareness and fight for refugees and asylum seekers whose voices can too often be marginalised. If you want to know more about these campaigns, I can put a link in the chat. Just let me know about this after, because I don't have time to go into all the different campaigns. We also have recently set up a blog called Najum, which has its Arabic origin and meaning, which means star. And we felt like this is very important because it empowers the fact that refugees, the vast majority of them, speak Arabic. This initiative was by Rohan in our exec and has been a fantastic way to allow those in society to get involved during the pandemic and spread the word on important issues such as identity, family, music, friends, belonging. And we hope to also touch on topics such as sustainability and climate change and how it implicates the issues on refugees and asylum seekers in the future. With regards to sustainability, STAR at Warwick has recently been involved in raising awareness about climate change and sustainability and hopes to do a lot more in the future. We recently have done this through events such as an interactive talk held on the 13th of February in collaboration with Warwick Fast Fashion Mobilisation. In this talk, we raised awareness about the reality of fast fashion, with many of those exploited being refugees and asylum seekers. This is often disproportionate as well. This is because they are often not earning enough money, so have to resort to these informal jobs to make ends meet. Indeed, under the UK law, asylum seekers in particular are not permitted to find employment, yet are expected to survive on just £39 a week. This is why they often resort to exploitative sweatshops and the fast fashion industry. This links to one of the campaigns actually that we are supporting at the moment called Lift the Ban, which advocates for the right to work for those seeking asylum. This talk raised awareness on the horrific facts of environmental implications of fast fashion too, and the unsustainable and immoral aspects of fast fashion. Also next year, I think we may look towards more sustainable forms of fundraising, such as things such as clothes swap, to raise awareness on fast fashion and try and find sustainable ways to, I suppose, to work with goods that aren't being used anymore and raise money for STAR. As a society this year, more than ever, we have been more interactive on social media, often putting links on our Instagram page for petitions, and also links for interesting podcasts to listen surrounding the topics of refugees and asylum seekers. One in particular which stood out to me was our link to a petition by the Environmental Justice Foundation of the subject of climate refugees. This petition is calling on countries to rapidly and fully implement the Paris Agreement, and also calls on government to recognise climate refugees and support a new legal agreement to guarantee their rights. STAR has spoken more about climate refugees in the last few years, and it's an extremely important issue, so we will be talking about it in the coming years to come. The term climate refugee is often used in the media and other discussions. However, this phrase can cause a lot of confusion because it doesn't actually exist under international law. Under the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, a refugee is defined as a person who has crossed an international border owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. So the term climate refugee is not endorsed by the UNHCR. And it is more accurately referred to as being person displaced in the context of disasters and climate change. So they're often called environmental migrants, which means that they aren't treated in the same way as refugees. This is, I think this is an issue, climate refugees, that we need to address more, because there's statistics that today 1% of the world is barely livable hot zone, and by 2020 that portion could go up to 19%. Every year since 2008, an average of 26.4 million around the world have been forcibly displaced by floods, windstorms, earthquakes or droughts. This is the equivalent of one person being displaced every single second. The International Federation of the Red Cross estimates that there are currently more environmental refugees than political refugees. I thought this statistic was extremely interesting because I think often media can focus a lot on political refugees, but we have to realise the importance of environmental refugees too. As the climate crisis continues throughout the 21st century, the world's most vulnerable populations will be hit disproportionately. Rising sea levels are expected to displace 150 million by 2050. I think these figures can always seem very overwhelming, of course, but I think it's important that we need to address them and for people to be more aware of what's going on. I think also we need to try and address the issue of climate refugees, because as a powerful line by British Somalian poet Warsan Shire said, that no one leaves home unless the home is the mouth of a shark. And this indicates the fact that people aren't leaving because they have choice, they have to leave. So we need to provide the protection that they need. Ingrading the protection of those displaced by climate in law is now imperative, because climate change is a global issue that needs global coordination to fix it. That is why STAR is trying to campaign and will continue to campaign on climate refugees, fast fashion, and the use of refugees within fast fashion, and raise awareness on this issue, trying to fundraise in more sustainable ways too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. I think it's very important to think about the effect that climate change does have on individuals around the world. One of the other stats that I have is that we're looking potentially at 1 billion people being displaced by the end of this century due to various climate issues. And that does include people potentially in London as well, with the rising sea levels as well. So it's not just faraway countries, which are already being hit right now, but it will come home, as it were, in the not too distant future. So linking the people to people, I'd like to next introduce our keynote speaker for the evening, Clover Hogan. She is a 21-year-old climate activist, a researcher on EcoAnxiety, and founder and executive director of Force of Nature. Force of Nature is a youth non-profit mobilizing mindsets for climate action. Through virtual programs, they empower young people in more than 50 countries to cultivate mindsets of agency, purpose and resilience, and work with decision makers across business, policy and civil society to drive intergenerational solutions. Clover's worked alongside the world's leading authorities on sustainability and consulted with the boardrooms of Fortune 500 companies. She's launched the Force for Nature podcast, serves as a trustee to the Global Action Plan, and is on the advisory board of the National Community Lotteries Climate Action Fund, the Teach the Future campaign, and the COP26 President-designated Civil Society and Youth Advisory Councils. So welcome, Clover. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry that was such a mouthful to read. Amazing. Well, it is an absolute pleasure to be dialing in and to be joining everyone here this evening. Thank you for taking the time, and I know it's been a lot of talking, so feel free as I'm introducing myself to get up and stretch and maybe do a little bit of jump around, get your body moving so that you don't feel completely cemented to your seat. In the meantime, I'll share a little bit of background of who I am, where I come from, and how that has really led me to do the work that I do today. So by way of introduction, I am a 21-year-old climate activist and, as was mentioned, the founder and executive director of Force of Nature. Now, I grew up in Australia's tropical North Queensland, fishing frogs out of the toilet and dodging snakes that hung from the ceiling. So my living room really only had 3 walls, and I spent more time outside than in. And for me, that meant that nature was never an other. It was really the cornerstone of my experience. Growing up, I was not allowed to watch horror films, so I turned to documentaries instead. I watched The Cove, Food Inc., An Inconvenient Truth. I watched mass dolphin hunts that turned the shoreline red. I watched as million-year-old forests were bulldozed to produce Big Macs. And I watched as Al Gore projected graphs that showed how fast we were devouring the planet and how good we were at turning a blind eye. I was filled with despair and anger, frustration, a deep sadness. And the thing that filled me with the most frustration was not so much seeing those horrific images, but the fact that the adults in my life were so good at pretending they weren't happening. We didn't talk about climate change or the ecological crisis at the dinner table. I didn't learn about it in the classroom. I didn't hear about it in media. I certainly didn't hear about it from Australian politicians. So I became, at the age of 11, really fascinated with why we shut down in the face of existential threats like climate change. Why do we kind of pull the blanket over our heads and pretend that there's someone else's problem or that they're simply not going to affect us? So that was really the spark that catalyzed my obsession, which it now is, around climate psychology. And I'll get to that in a moment. But that tipping point for me, watching those documentaries, feeling incredibly frustrated and despairing, was really the moment when I decided that I wanted to commit the rest of my life to becoming an environmentalist. Now, I didn't know what that was going to look like. On some level, I thought maybe it meant chaining myself to a tree or riding a zodiac into the path of a whaling ship. On the other, I thought perhaps I'd have to go and become a climate scientist and study in the Arctic. But within a couple of years, I had managed to coerce my parents into leaving Australia and moving to Indonesia so that I could go to a place called Green School, which is wall-less bamboo classrooms in the middle of the jungle. And beyond the compost toilets, the thing that makes Green School unique is that instead of asking students to pursue careers that we have no particular love for, it asks students which problems in the world we want to solve. So from that age of 13, I was thinking, which is that challenge that I want to take on? Which is that challenge that I want to commit myself to? And I learned what that problem was as I started kind of finding my feet as an activist. I started out making documentary films, speaking, communicating, using my love for language to be able to communicate the urgency of these challenges. I started working with decision makers across business and policy and civil society. And at 16, I found myself at COP21 in Paris, so the global climate meeting where all of the world's leaders assemble to really decide the fate of our planet and our future. And it was there as a student lobbyist that I kind of arrived with a starry-eyed optimism about the change that we would see. And this was the tipping point where, tomorrow would not be the same. And yet I saw a lot of people in power who felt incredibly powerless. And I was reminded of that feeling that I experienced as a young girl at 11, watching those horrific images, and just how small I felt in the face of them. And the more I worked with leaders, the more I worked with students in the classroom, the more I realized how universal this feeling of powerlessness is. And that is the problem that I have committed myself to understanding why we shut down, and critically to understanding the role of mindset in being able to mobilize climate action. We've had the solutions for climate change. We've had the resources to address this on a global scale for decades. We've known about this crisis for 100 years, right? Scientists first discovered climate change before 1900. But the thing that we've been missing is this mass mobilization. And when you ask most people what they feel they can do, the answer is nothing, right? This challenge feels so enormous. It fills us with so much despair and denial that we have no idea how to even take that first step. And so that was really what catalyzed Force of Nature. So we are a nonprofit working with students in 52 countries to really cultivate mindsets of agency, determination, and resilience. We work with an enabling ecosystem of leaders to create spaces for young people at the decision-making table. And why we focus on mental health in particular and the intersection of mental health and the climate crisis is because the one piece of this challenge that we often disregard is its impact on our well-being. Now, we know that climate crisis poses major health challenges, right, to frontline communities. And there are lots of people, particularly in the global south, who are already living that reality, right? The health impacts of having your home swept away by flooding in Jakarta, or rising sea levels in the Maldives, or losing your home to fires in my home country in Australia. But there is another more insidious impact of the climate crisis, and that is something that we call eco-anxiety. So eco-anxiety is something we've been researching for a couple of years now, and it's unique in that it's experienced by people on the front lines of the climate crisis, but it's also experienced by people for whom the climate crisis is a distant threat. Now, growing up in a bubble of climate privilege in Australia, climate change was something that I read about. It wasn't something that I lived through. And yet from that early age, I experienced eco-anxiety, even though I didn't have the language for it then. And what the research is showing us is that eco-anxiety is on the rise in young people around the world. So eco-anxiety, to be super specific, relates to those feelings of anger and stress and panic in the face of the climate crisis. In extreme cases, it can also be the feeling of insomnia. It can be real panic attacks, and it can even mean suicidal ideation for young people looking to the future and finding it too unbearable to even imagine. Now, research from 2019 showed that in the UK, over 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds said they felt eco-anxious. And just last year, research conducted with child psychiatrists, over half of them surveyed said that their own patients were also feeling eco-anxiety. we've found the same on a global scale through Force of Nature. So we sat down and interviewed and surveyed over 500 young people in 52 countries to understand their emotional and mental response to the climate crisis. And what we found was that over 70% of young people said that climate change negatively contributed to their mental health. Over 70% said they felt hopeless in the face of the climate crisis. And just 26% of young people said they knew how they could actually make a contribution to solving this challenge. So a lot of young people are falling into despair. And when I share some of those stats, the gut reaction can be, okay, well, perhaps we need to fix eco-anxiety, right? We need to get young people feeling mentally well, and we need to try and suppress that response. And yet we would never want to pathologize eco-anxiety, right? Because eco-anxiety is a perfectly natural human response. And many climate psychologists would argue that the problem isn't eco-anxiety and young people feeling eco-anxiety. The problem is that more adults should be feeling eco-anxious, particularly adults in positions of power. Now, I experienced eco-anxiety for a long time, and I thought it was something that I had to kind of beat into submission. I thought those feelings of despair about the future and a deep sadness at the sixth mass extinction, I thought those were weaknesses that I should try and beat into submission and overcome. And yet, when the fire started raging back home in Australia, I found myself completely inconsolable. And I started spontaneously crying. I would cry on the tube going to work. I would cry in the shower. I would cry in meetings. And I realized that I was going through grief. Back home in Australia, I was losing my culture. I was losing my childhood. I had friends who were poised on tin roofs, trying to escape the smoke and embers, clinging to their clothes, holding hoses to beat back the flames. And it was horrifying. And I realized that I couldn't keep performing the mental gymnastics. I had to understand how to create space for those feelings. I had to acknowledge them and befriend them. We live in a society that, tells us there's such thing as good feelings and bad feelings, and certain feelings we should run away from. And yet we each experience life with the full color palette of emotions, right? And particularly when it comes to the climate crisis, a challenge that is only going to continue to define our lives, define our generation. We have to build up the container of agency so that we can deal with those feelings. Now, close cousin to eco-anxiety is a term called ecophobia. And ecophobia relates specifically to that feeling of powerlessness in the face of environmental catastrophe. Why I draw a distinction between these two is because we want to create space for eco-anxiety. We don't want to suppress it. And yet when those feelings become too much, when I feel like I'm drowning in the grief or frustration or anger or anxiety, that's when they can tip into powerlessness. And that's when, instead of those feelings waking me up and driving me to take action, they can really shut me down. And we see how this plays out both in young people and in older generations. So I've spoken to 8 and 9-year-olds in the classroom who, when I ask them about the future they envision, it's something out of a dystopian blockbuster of empty supermarket shelves and cities underwater, a planet in decline, and the kind of place no one wants to find waiting for them when they grow up. Young people are falling into despair, into that paralysis, into that powerlessness, to the point where they look to the future and it's too much to handle. On the flip side of despair, we have denial. And this is the state that we find a lot of adults in. Now, denial has many different shapes and colors. There's the stereotype, right, which is that climate change isn't happening. And yet that's becoming increasingly less common as the science prevails and as climate change takes front and center stage in our collective awareness. But it does show up in other ways. I often hear techno-utopianism, kind of blind faith that technology and technological solutions out of Silicon Valley will fix all of our problems. Bill Gates's recent work is a really good example of this, where he kind of said climate change can be solved by pumping more iron into the ocean or pumping certain chemicals into the sky that will create more cloud cover. Typical kind of geoengineering solutions that created a lot of uproar in the climate and scientific community because they allow us to think of solutions that band-aid and plaster over the problems without addressing the underlying institutional problems that are driving forward the climate crisis. For example, capitalism, an economic system that is based on limitless growth with finite resources. We also see denial when adults say, well, it's not up to me, someone else will fix it, the business leaders or the government, right? Sometimes it shows up in kind of handing the baton over to young people. Oh my God, this empowered generation is going to step up and save the day. Now, despair and denial might appear to exist on opposite ends of the generational spectrum, yet they ultimately stem from the same place, and that is how powerless we feel. I've heard the same stories on repeat working in classrooms and working in boardrooms. Stories such as, I'm too small to make a difference. I'm not smart enough. I don't have the expertise. The system is too broken to create meaningful change. Our society too enslaved to the status quo, too short-sighted. Our politicians too corrupt, right? So all of these stories that really remove us from the picture, in essence. The story of despair sounds something like, it's not up to me because it's too big to fix, while the story of denial sounds like, it's not up to me because someone else will fix it. So neither despair nor denial help anyone. We need to learn how to hold tension, how to create space for our emotions, and critically, we need to understand the stories that are keeping us paralyzed, the stories that are not facilitating our agency and our action, but the stories that keep us feeling too small, too helpless. Before we dive into the secret sauce for how we can begin to do that and shift from feeling powerless, shift from feeling overly anxious, to having real agency and feeling empowered to create change, I want to quickly give you a backdrop to climate psychology to understand what's really happening beneath the surface. So at Force of Nature, in our research, we look at powerlessness in 3 different buckets. So the first one we have is human wiring. Now, this relates to how our brains are wired and how their wiring is kind of poorly set up to respond to a challenge like climate change. So we humans are wired to respond to sudden, intimate attacks. For our ancestors long ago, that meant they were really good at responding to a saber-toothed tiger leaping at them from the bush. Or for us today in the 21st century, that could be someone swerving toward you on the pavement with a bicycle, right? So we're wired for fight or flight, these kind of trigger responses. Now, historically, even knowing of climate change, it hasn't activated that defensive mechanism because it is so large and because it is historically so slow moving. It's not something I can hold, it's not something I can see, it's not something visceral. A lot of psychologists use the analogy of the frog in the pot of slowly boiling water. When the frog jumps in, the water is cool, but it starts to warm and warm. And what the frog doesn't realize is that it's swimming above a flame. The frog doesn't try to hop out until that water is boiling. Then we have optimism bias, and this is the fact that we humans are pretty much wired to see the world through rose-tinted glasses. So setting aside the eco-anxious folk in the audience, we tend to think that the world will ultimately resolve itself, that things will work out. You know, no human civilization has been able to comprehend its own impending demise. It's really hard for us to wrap our heads around that. We always think that human ingenuity or something else will save the day. And part of the challenge with much of the generation currently in power is that in their lives, something, some technology, some person has always fixed a problem. And yet that is not true of a challenge like the climate crisis, nor is it true of an existential threat like a pandemic. We see how poor and negligent much of the leadership has been in response to an unprecedented challenge like the one we're living through right now. And then the third piece that we have in our kind of human psychology and how we're wired is around loss aversion. Now, this is true, I think, for pretty much all of us, and that is that we are more afraid of losing things in the short term than we are in the long. So I don't want to give up the creature comforts that bring me so much joy, even if I know that they have really terrible unintended consequences, either for someone else or in the future. That could be eating meat, it could be buying clothes on the high street, it could be driving a car instead of taking public transport. So that's a quick whistle-stop tour into human psychology. Next up, we have cultural narratives, and these are the meta kind of stories that we subscribe to as a society. How I like to think about these meta stories is through extrinsic values and intrinsic values. So extrinsic values relate to things like competition or comparison, consumerism. Intrinsic values relate to the good ones, like contribution and connection and community. Now, we see that so many of the influences on our lives, and I think this is especially true of young people growing up today, push us toward those extrinsic values. We can take the example of social media, right? When I go on Instagram, the algorithm is constantly bombarding me with photos and with content that really compares me to other people, but doesn't really make me feel very good about myself. My self-worth is literally equated by the number of likes that I have on a photo. In one way or another, I'm being told that I'm not pretty enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not good enough. And then the advertisers come in to say, well, so long as you buy this makeup brand, or you buy this outfit, or you buy this product, you'll feel better, you'll be okay. So our sense of worth and contribution is constantly being placed outside of ourselves, ultimately in someone else's control. And in many ways, the same can be said of the education system, right? I was very fortunate to grow up literally going to school in the jungle, but I did go to regular high school at a couple of points, and my experience is that all of the students were kind of treated like a set of averages. At one point, I went to high school at a public lycée, a high school in France. And there was one moment where we were all kind of being shepherded from class to class, and we were just in lectures all day and just constantly downloading information that we were never taught to challenge or question. Our creativity was really snuffed out of us, and it felt like watching Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, a short film that shows these kind of workers being churned through a factory like sheep. That is truly what it felt like. Now, that education system, again, tells us to commodify our values and says that we're only worth so much as what we can turn into a career, what we can get a degree for, what we can go find a well-paying 9-to-5 job for. And those skills, be they creative or artistic or around lateral critical thinking, are not really worth anything unless they can be translated into that cookie cutter 9-to-5. And I don't think much needs to be said of the 9-to-5 other than there's a lot wrong with it. And again, it pushes us toward focusing on making a certain amount of money in terms of being able to sustain a job. If you're someone who works for a big, fast-moving consumer goods company, a big corporation, chances are you've been told for the past 25 years that it's your job to climb that corporate ladder and to deliver value to shareholders, to kind of avoid taking the risks that could cost you your job, right? It totally detracts you and distracts you from what's happening in the wider world, from thinking about challenges like the climate crisis, because you're so focused on survival rather than how to actually thrive and how to create a world that thrives. So that's a flavor of cultural narratives. and how they impact us. And finally, and where most of our work really happens at Force of Nature, we have self-limiting beliefs. And I already touched on these earlier around the stories that kind of play out in our minds that keep us feeling too small to make a difference, that keep us feeling powerless to really create change. And again, these stories can be imprinted upon us by our peers, they can be imprinted upon us by our school, our wider society, how we absorb information on social media. And of course, they can come from within us. You know, if we have kind of core destructive beliefs of having no power, of being too small to do anything. And we can see really how these stories affect our ability to make decisions. If I give you an example, if my story is that I'm powerless, then my expectation is that any change I try to create will have no meaning, no impact. My attitude will kind of be, what's the point, right? Quite pessimistic that change is even possible. And that doesn't create a very positive environment to make decisions. How we describe this at Force of Nature is through the acronym SEED with an A. So stories, expectations, attitudes, and decisions. If we reverse that for a second, and the story that I subscribe to about myself is that I do have power, I do have influence, I have the ability to create change in the world, then my expectation is, so long as I focus my energy on something long enough, so long as I step up, so long as I focus in on a single problem that I want to solve with tenacity and consistency, then I will have influence, I will have impact. My attitude is determined, positive, not naively so, but in an ambitious way about the world that we can create. And of course, that creates a pretty positive mental space and headspace to make decisions, to take action, to step up rather than to shut down. So that's a bit of a background and context around what's really happening within our minds when we face up to something like climate change. And where I'd like to really segue and end this is in thinking how we facilitate that shift, as I alluded to earlier. So I have 4 steps that I want to share with you tonight, which are really a culmination of the work that we do at Force of Nature and many years of obsessing and just being really curious about how I can kind of master my own mindset as well. Because there are days when it's really, really hard. There are days when I don't want to get up out of bed. There are days where I feel incredibly frustrated by the pace of change, by the vested interests. And I fall back on these tools to help me get out of bed, to help me feel determined, and to hold tension between some of those uncomfortable feelings. So the first one is to step into your emotions rather than away from them. And quickly, before I forget, if anyone has any questions before I wrap up, feel free to pop them in the chat as well. So the first one is to step into your emotions rather than away from them. Now, this might seem really obvious, but again, we live in a culture and a society that tells us to disallow certain feelings, including anxiety, including stress. And we're often trying to fix one another or fix ourselves. But what we've seen as eco-anxiety is a perfectly natural human response. Eco-anxiety is something that we should not push away. And eco-anxiety is something that we must create space for. Because again, part of the reason we're in this crisis and so far along without meaningful action is because we've gotten so good at numbing ourselves to the threat, to kind of turning away from it, even as we're hurtling toward that cliff. So be honest with how you're feeling. Even the good, even the bad, even the ugly. And ask other people too. This is what was so powerful about starting Force of Nature and having conversations with young people from literally every corner. You begin to realize that you're in no way alone. You realize that so many people out there are having the same feelings, are having the same experience. And feelings of grief and sadness should not be experienced alone. They should be experienced in the comfort and holding of other people. Then, identify those stories that are keeping you from taking action. So while those emotions can be an incredible catalyst to to really help us step up. Stories are often what get in the way of us following through on those emotions and taking action. So ask yourself now, what is that story that keeps me feeling super small and powerless? It could be, and I hear this often with young people, is that I'm too young, I don't have the experience. Now, I have 100 stories that I could share. In the interest of time, I'm not going to this evening, but there is no such thing as age being a barrier. There is no such thing as experience being a barrier. I started working in the climate space when I was 11 years old. I went on to work at a startup in Silicon Valley, Impossible Foods, which makes meat from plants, when I was 17. I never got a university degree. I don't have traditional qualifications. And there are so many people out there who have just decided that the most important prerequisite is passion. The most important prerequisite is care and empathy. So identify that story and then begin to think about what is in your power, what you could do to challenge it. Not what would need to happen in the outside world, right? If that story is that the system is too broken, there are too many problems, you're not going to fix it by trying to unbreak the system, right? You have to do something within yourself so that you can reframe that from being a problem to being an opportunity, to reimagine a world, to reimagine what those systems might look like. What that could be is, if you're feeling incredibly overwhelmed by the number of problems, focusing in on the single problem that ignites that fire in your belly, that creates those feelings that are the kind of compass that tell you that's the thing that you should be focusing on. Then, once you've stepped into your feelings, you've identified those mental barriers by way of the stories that you subscribe to, that's when you want to focus in on an issue. I mentioned that often we feel overwhelmed because we're spread over so many issues. And I feel this way every time I go on Instagram, right? There are like 100 different social causes and environmental issues that pull on my heartstrings and that I want to do something about. And yet, to try and take action across all of them is kind of like trying to juggle 100 balls, right? You're bound to drop all of them. So instead of dissipating your energy, think about the single problem that you really want to take action on, right? And the more focused it can be, the more impact and power you will have. And I think this is something that every change maker in history has really known to be true. Impact comes from focus. It's as simple as that. And then finally, get the clarity and focus of your passion. So in the same way you want to identify, here's the problem I want to commit myself to, you want to think through the same lens about the skills and talents and passions that you bring to the table. Now, passion is a kind of overrated, loaded word, right? When I think about passion, I think about curiosity. Where does my curiosity lie? Is it in making music? Is it in food? Is it in fashion? What's the thing that excites me? Because even more important than external sustainability is internal sustainability. And you can only sustain your action for so long through those feelings of frustration and anger, right? You need to find emotions that will actually support and sustain your activism. And I find that the secret way to do that is to very simply dial in on what you love doing. If you're a passionate musician, then how might we communicate the urgency of the climate crisis through universal language? If you love clothes, if your passion is fashion, then how do we change our relationship to clothes so that it isn't just fully disposable? If you're motivated by your gut, you love cooking, you love food, then how can we transition the world to a plant-based kind of agriculture? How might we stop a third of the world's food from being wasted every day? I really believe that the world is, and this is going to sound cheesy, but it is a 7.8 billion piece puzzle in which everyone has a place. There's an amazing resource called Project Drawdown, which is the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. And what it shows us is that not just are the solutions incredibly diverse, from food waste management to protecting tropical forests, to educating girls, to providing women their reproductive rights. but they're all interconnected. And we need lots and lots of people from the ground up taking ownership of those problems and showing up with their passion and grit and tenacity to really solve them. So I'm aware of the time. I want to say a huge thank you for the opportunity to connect with all of you today. It has been an absolute pleasure. And I really encourage you to reach out to connect with Force of Nature. You can find us at forceofnature.xyz on Instagram, I just had a mental blank, on Facebook and LinkedIn, all of the platforms. I've lost track at this point because there are so many. And you can also find me at Clover Hogan on all of the same. We deliver programs and classrooms to schools, students, educators all around the world. We work with a global network of students, so we're always looking for impassioned young people who want to join the movement and who want to have a seat at the decision-making table. So please do reach out and stay in touch, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Clover. I think that's certainly given everybody a lot to think about. And also thank you so much for making yourself available tonight. I know that there's a time difference in Athens, I believe it is. So thank you so much. Do you have a few moments to stay on the line for if there's a couple of questions from people? Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. I can't see them from my screen, so you'll have to share them with me.
Okay, we will do. I'm also going to ask all the other panelists to share their cameras and unmute themselves as well. And I'm also going to, while that's happening, introduce a surprise panelist, Joel Cardinal, who is Head of Energy and Sustainability at the University of Warwick. He leads the sustainability strategy to promote efficient use of energy, water and resources, as well as promoting well-being and supporting sustainable education and research. Previous to working at Warwick, Joel's had a number of management positions in the automotive industry, and he's worked in UK, France, and coached quality operations in 15 countries worldwide. So welcome, Joel, as well. So do we have any questions? If people would like to put their hand up, I can allow you to unmute. Or if you'd like to drop any questions into the chat.
Can I ask a question to Clover?
Please do. I think Clover's blown everyone else away, so
yeah.
Off you go, Joel.
Well, no, thank you very much. I mean, it's not very easy to clap or say thank you, but it was very great, inspiring talk. So thank you for that. I think I very much liked the part where you were talking about, basically taking. Oh, thank you, Chris. I didn't know we can do that. I think you said something about taking actions, even small ones, if we feel strong about it. And I think this is, well, in what we try to do, I kind of felt it was quite strong. So, there's more. For me, it's all about making people perhaps comfortable with the fact that they can take actions, even if they are small ones. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think part of the challenge is that the problems seem so overwhelming that, of course, our natural assumption is that anything I do will have a really, really small impact and is kind of insignificant. And yet that could not be further from the truth, right? It's lots of people taking collective action that really changes the agenda. And I think those actions need to come from a place of invitation rather than sacrifice, rather than thinking about, why am I wrong for doing something, or feeling shame about certain actions. The reality is the system that we live in makes it really difficult to be responsible. So the more you can focus on actions that nourish you, that make you feel really positive and that make you feel good, the more likely you are to sustain them. And in fact, those little actions are what snowball. My first action when I was an 11-year-old was to become vegetarian. And it was the cause of many, many debates in my household because my dad is French and he's also a chef. And so it was like kind of denying everything about his culture and everything that he stood for. And yet it was that single action that snowballed into major changes in our family that ended up being very positive, changes in my community that inspired me to learn about other issues too. And I'm still learning every single day. You know, I only really started to understand the impacts of fast fashion a couple of years ago. And I was like, okay, I can start doing things differently there. And in doing so, you will naturally inspire your sphere of influence. So individual action is so, so important.
Thank you, Clover. Thank you very much for that. Yeah.
Yeah, we got a couple of people thanking you, Clover, for a very empowering speech. We've got Alicia. If you just bear with me one moment, and I will allow you to unmute. Off you go, Alicia.
Hello, this is for Clover as well. I was just wondering if you have any suggestions as to how we can influence others to embrace sustainability, who may not be so open to acknowledging it. If you had any methods or I don't know, sources that we could potentially refer to just to try and get them to at least acknowledge the issue. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, and brilliant question. This is one that I learned the hard way. For a long time, I would try to convince people based on what I cared about. And I was like, this is the problem. Why aren't you outraged about it? And I would really try to impose my views and also impose my values. Now, I mentioned that very specific example of me being vegetarian and my dad having an emotional breakdown because of that decision. It was a source of tension in our family for a long time because we didn't align and because he couldn't understand where I was coming from. And so I was always pushing the kind of ethical and moral argument, which he just did not get on any level. And it wasn't until I started to try to understand where he was coming from that actually began to change. And I realized that by communicating the science and the research and talking about, you know, animal agriculture being the leading reason why the Amazon was on fire and these things that he understood and he got, we were suddenly able to find a kind of middle ground where he was like, oh, I completely get why you do that. And in turn, changed his own behavior too. So I think whenever you're trying to persuade or influence, you have to understand where that person is coming from and try to find the middle ground. And I think this is especially important in an environmental space that can be so kind of polarizing for a few reasons, right? If you're kind of working with business leaders, for example, they're in their own reality bubble where their motive at the end of the day is to make sure that they can, you know, pull in enough money and enough profit and sustain that kind of structure. So talking on a purely emotive level probably isn't going to create the kind of middle ground that you need to meet them. And the same is true of folks for whom thinking about sustainability is a privilege, right? I can't tell you how many communities there are in the UK who are struggling to keep the lights on at the end of the day, who are struggling to put food on the table. So if we begin to push an agenda, which is here's why you should go plant-based or buy organic or, you know, shift to an electric vehicle, that is so far removed from that person's lived experience that it's going to go completely over their head. So try to focus on where your other person is coming from. That would be my suggestion.
That's great. Thank you, Clover. I actually learned earlier on today that apparently 1 in 10 households in the UK alone are in fuel poverty at the moment, which normally has a direct kind of correlation to food poverty as well. So that's a very high number. Do we have any other questions at the moment? Jackie, we can see you coming on camera. Do you have a question? Nope. Okay. If you could just turn your camera off, please. Thank you. Any other questions at all? One of the ones I had here was when it comes to sustainability, what issues don't get talked about enough? And that's for anybody on the panel.
Sorry, do you want to rephrase just to make sure I get the right way?
Yeah. So generally, within the topics of sustainability, so all the different areas, what doesn't get talked about enough, and I'm sure in a way that maybe eco-anxiety is certainly one of those topics. It's only one that I've become aware of in the last couple of years. Chris, you've got your hand up. Do you want to go with that one?
Yeah. Well, I was just going to perhaps kick things off and reflect something that Hannah talked about a bit earlier, which is, I suppose it's the interdependencies, the intersectionality between not just climate and environment, but a range of other elements of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think we often miss out on those interdependencies because it's the big single issues that attract attention. So yes, energy, yes, biodiversity, and they are absolutely all clearly of huge importance. But I think it means that we sometimes lose those, the impacts on other sustainable development goals, whether that's around poverty, whether it's around social justice, whether it's around access to education. And I think the more we can try and understand those interdependencies and intersectionalities, the better we will be able to tackle some of the agendas that we need to address if we're going to deliver against those SDGs by 2030. So that would be my big area of concern. I think Catherine's probably also got something to add to that.
Yeah, no, I was just going to also say, I think with sustainability, there's the question which Clover already mentioned, I think about inclusiveness in terms of, I think the issue with sustainability is that it can't always relate to everybody. Say if you are from a lower income family and if you've got somebody, like Clover said, like saying that, oh, you should be turning to all these sustainable like foods and all these products, I think it can feel quite exclusive because you think, oh, I would, of course, if I could, but the reality sometimes makes it hard to do so. And I think there's also a huge issue surrounding the question of, I think, fashion as well, in terms of sustainable fashion brands, where they make it seem so amazing and great, but they're charging like hundreds of pounds. And it's ridiculous because you have influencers who sometimes there are more that are acknowledging it now, but sometimes I've seen it so many times on things like Instagram where they're not acknowledging the fact that it's so expensive, and that's the reason why maybe not as many people are buying into it. So I think that's a big thing that needs to be addressed, is trying to make it more inclusive.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that the words just transition work quite well for me, in that we do need to bring everybody along for this journey, and we can't leave anybody behind at all, whether it's physically or mentally. We need to bring everybody on the journey with us. Clover and Joel, do you have anything to add on that one?
No, yes, I have. Or Clover, you want to? Cool. No, okay. I think for me, I was first thinking of probably with my engineer cap, and it's probably not quite the right place. I certainly feel that if I would be in a state of eco-anxiety, perhaps I would feel overwhelmed. Says, well, I want to do something, but where do I start? And sometimes I think it's possible. It's difficult, like the example of the fast fashion we just heard, to know, well, what does have an influence. Is it stopping tea, or not having another one, or doing open fire, or not changing my clothes? And from a technical point of view, I think it would be useful that people understand what is their personal footprint in terms of in their life, at work or at home, what makes a difference on the planet. Some do, some don't, or more or less. And perhaps it would be a little bit easier even to take small actions, as we were saying before, on the one that's have an influence and we feel we can do something about. So maybe a bit of a mix on what we feel comfortable with and what we think has a contribution in the planet. if we realize 6 months after that what I've tried doing is absolutely worthless, it's not going to put my confidence very, very high. So interesting question, David. Thank you.
I can see Hannah's joined us. Do you want to input on this, Hannah?
Yeah, sorry, my camera was messing around a bit then. I guess kind of thinking with what you're saying, sort of the little actions that people can take every day don't get talked about enough. Like loads of people, like there's lots of people thinking that the only thing I can do is go and do a protest, and that's brilliant, that's great. But little actions every day, like just washing out your recycling before you put it in the recycling bin. I think that's a little thing that that doesn't get talked about.
Yeah, we all need to start somewhere, and I do sometimes feel that people try and take on and bite off more than they can chew when they're starting their journey. I tend to recommend actually people start in the bathroom when they're looking to switch things over and move to kind of reusable items, because there's a lot of plastics and things that they can switch in the bathroom. So that's a good place. Another question that I had then was, what are the key issues that potentially Warwick University itself needs to address? And I'm going to include the SU into that as well, so you can answer that as well, Hannah. Chris, do you want to go first?
Well, I kind of feel like I probably ought to. And my immediate reaction is to say, how long have we got to answer that question? We've set some ambitious targets. Perhaps you might think we should have been more ambitious. I think we've tried to stretch ourselves, but also set targets that we've got the potential to realise. But those targets mean we've got lots to do. We are making an awful lot of progress on, I shouldn't say these are the easy things, but looking at decarbonisation. We're making a lot of progress there. It's become easier as the grid itself has decarbonised. I think the massive challenge for us is around a lot of our Scope 3 emissions and the challenges we face in terms of trying to drive out the impact of our indirect activities. If you look at things, we're proud of our reputation as an international university. We do some fantastic work in areas such as global health, in terms of global and social justice. And a lot of that's reflected in the SDG report. But one of the things that means is inevitably we have people travelling a lot. And in some of the countries we work in, that will mean that they're travelling long distances. So that creates challenges. We bring international students to Warwick. That creates challenges because, again, very significant impact in terms of emissions. So how do we think about changing the way in which we provide education? We do a lot of research. We're a research-intensive university. We use our research to try and make an impact, but our research itself can be energy-intensive. And space, we've got some massive challenges around how we reduce our space footprint, because one of the big changes for us will be to reduce the amount of space per person on campus. Underlying all of that, I think, and it comes back to some of the comments that people have just been making about small changes, about thinking about how we behave differently. We need to change behaviours. And we need to change behaviours across a community of 30,000 people. And we need that to reach out into our communities locally, regionally, and beyond. So I think these are all elements that are high up on the list. I could probably go on and talk more about about reuse, recycling, about waste. I'm not going to do that because you heard quite a bit about that, but I do think we have some massive agendas that we need to address, and we need to get more people engaged, and we need to make it very clear that this is a key strategic priority for the university.
Thank you, Chris. Does anybody else want to talk on this question?
Yeah, well, I certainly can add that. I think for me, and perhaps on the continuation of what I was trying to say earlier, that we need to make people understand what's around them so they can take actions. And as Chris was speaking, I think there is a Chinese proverb who says, the longest journey starts with the first step. I guess in our case, the journey is long and we need to do it quickly, but we still have to do the first step. And we were having an interesting conversation today with WMG, who are very willing to do that first step. And we realized that there are things we can do. We know lots of our equipments are very important, and quite a number of them probably are plugged in 24/7, and it costs a lot of money. And by talking with them, we realized that perhaps there are ways to reorganize ourselves, so they could be running different times, or they could be running by, different schedules, and that should make a difference. It may be a small difference, but if each, student or staff or research team makes a small difference, it should add up to quite a lot, and this is what we're looking for. So I think yes, I suppose for me it's a confidence that there is a desire to change, and then it's individual steps.
Thank you, Joel. Hannah, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was just thinking how the idea of a responsibility to tackle the climate is a tricky one, because I often think of the climate crisis as it's no one person's fault, but at the same time it's everyone's. So that's a really hard concept to grasp. And when it comes to organisations like Warwick, I'd say then the responsibility that Warwick holds is to enable its students and staff and everyone who's part of the Warwick community to make those small changes that they want to make. Big changes, and just to provide them with enabling environments. And it's really good to these conversations and things like this to see how we're going to change how we've got this new to enable students to do those sorts of things, and also just responding to what the students ask, and do it in that sort of way. I'd say that's what organisations like Warwick have in terms of responsibility to the climate crisis, and being responsible for it.
Yeah, I mean, leading on to that, there was one more question of what responsibility do individuals and organisations have to tackle the climate crisis? What is our responsibility? Chris?
So again, I think perhaps worth me kicking off on that one. And I'll talk particularly from the university perspective, but the things we do matter. And it is the enabling that Hannah's talked about. The things that we do will shape the future. We're visible. People look at us, they take notice. We educate, and this I think is hugely important, because in educating, we're influencing the people who will shape the future, whether that's our students or actually whether it's our broader outreach and engagement. But we also research to change the future, and we need to make sure that we're doing the sort of research that will have a real impact. Some of that is about technical mitigations, for sure, but some of it is about how people behave and how we can drive the kind of changes that everyone's been discussing this evening. And others is about recognising some of those complex interdependencies we talked about earlier. But it's that responsibility to say, look, the things that we do matter, and we have the ability to change through the core activities of teaching and research. And that's not just any one individual, it's all of us, and it's actually the institution as a whole. And I think people will take notice of what we do, and we are able to set an example. So I think we've got a huge responsibility.
Thank you, Chris. Anybody else want to speak to this?
Sorry, unmuting myself is better. I think we do have a responsibility, or we do have. It's interesting. I think we have a collective and a personal responsibility. There's many parallels. We've been having those conversations with Chris many times. For me, there are many parallels between health safety and sustainability. Both are asking people to adopt a mindset. Nobody wants to get injured, and if you go to work, you have a responsibility to take the protective equipment you're given, and your employer has a responsibility to give them to you. And I think sustainability is a bit the same. We, as Chris explained, we have a responsibility to engage everybody and explain and lead by example, but hopefully everybody's sharing the responsibility to support and make the journey with us. So that's an interesting point. I think, yes, it's certainly a shared journey, and but we have had conversation with Anna and others, and there's more and more staff and students who come along with us, so that's good news.
Kate?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say a similar thing. The fact that like these organizations, this is like, they shouldn't see it as a responsibility, as like something they're holding on their shoulders. It should be seen as like a good thing that you have the opportunity to make the change. And I think also in line with all the responses of these small changes, realizing that you can't shy away from it anymore, that sometimes even these small changes you can incorporate into these organizations, and it doesn't have to be necessarily expensive or too time consuming that you don't have time for it, because like it's a poor excuse to say, oh, we can't implement it now. Like, got to realize that actually you do have a responsibility, but like I say, it doesn't have to be a taxing responsibility.
And Hannah?
Yeah. Oh gosh, it's just gone out my head. But yeah, so just sort of recognizing that you can do anything in your own means. And so if you have a means to be able to do something, then do it, or something like this. And sorry, mind blank has just really got to me right now.
That's fine.
Recognizing if you hear stories, or if you see that other people or other groups are being disproportionately affected by climate change, then I think we have a responsibility to stand with them in solidarity and recognize this and raise their voices to a platform using our privileges to make cause more well known. When it comes to how climate change may be disproportionately affecting them.
Yeah,
I remembered.
I agree. I also think that sometimes changing behavior can seem like a very daunting thing. And through my training with climate reality a couple of years ago, it made me realize just how easy it can be. It's just a case of repeating that good behavior, those things that you know you can do again and again, and then it doesn't become something that you think about. It just becomes second nature, and that's where we can very much, I think, start with some of the smaller things that we can do before kind of working up to the larger things. Chris?
Yeah, I was just going to build on that, David, and say, one of the things that we talk a lot about is nudges. And it's all of those small changes, those different perspectives that we can put in place that just make it easy to do things differently. And give you an example, our travel policy used to emphasise lowest cost for travel. And so if you wanted to travel from the West Midlands to Scotland, the lowest cost way was to fly. And if you wanted to take the train, you had to get special permission. All we do is turn that round. We now say, if you're doing that journey, you do it by train. If you want to if you want to use the plane, you've got to get special permission. Yeah, and it just flips things. And I think there's a lot that we can do that makes it easy for people to change their behaviours and to do things differently. And it's something important, but it's something where we can really use our research and our education activity to work out which of those nudges have the most impact, how we can actually drive some of that change, and how we can make it easy for people to behave differently. And that seems to me to be hugely important.
Thank you. A question for Clover. Obviously, you've been doing a lot of work with some large organisations and organisations across the world, from the sounds of it. What have you found are actually some of the really kind of useful things to be able to engage with the organisations of different sizes, but what ones that kind of connected with them the best way to get them to actually make those changes? Because we are individuals, we've got things that we can do, but also it's the larger groups, and as you said earlier, sometimes they can have that kind of bit of barrier to kind of feeling like they could do something.
Yes, thank you for the question. I do have to hop on another meeting in 1 minute, so I'm going to try and keep this short and sweet. But I think, again, it comes back to that point around how can you identify what the people in those rooms and in those spaces ultimately care about. And often we think about organizations or institutions as these really inhuman kind of structures that are so powerful and all-encompassing that we forget that they're ultimately made up of groups of people, and groups of people who are accessible and, in more cases than not, want to make a difference, right? Want to actually be able to do something, but often feel the most kind of powerless of all. So in my experience working with business leaders, it's about meeting them halfway, about talking about the opportunity that exists beyond the kind of responsibility, to Catherine's point earlier. So what is the invitation that I'm creating here, and how can I make it as easy as possible for that person to really do the right thing? So you dial up the urgency a little bit to say, we can't afford another 10 years of incrementalism, but also the people who take charge with this opportunity are the ones who are going to be the front runners. And then the other thing, we take a kind of Trojan horse approach as force of nature, which is that we go in talking about the opportunity and how to really mobilize this next generation. And usually where the conversation lands is, what is the world that you're going to be leaving to your kids, right? And in every conversation in a boardroom we've had, when we ask those leaders, why are you in that room? It's not because they've read some IPCC report saying that we need to keep warming within 1.5 degrees. It's because their child has come home to them at the end of the day and said, Mom, Dad, what are you doing about climate change? So this intergenerational exchange is so critically important. And it's also part of the reason why I believe everyone, including the 6-year-old at that dinner table, has enormous, enormous power. So don't alienate, don't try to dehumanize or think of people in suits as the bad guys, right? They want to do the right thing. They often just don't have the answers. They don't have the visibility to imagine what those solutions could look like. So make it possible for them to join you at the table. And with that, I'm going to say thank you so much. I have to hop off now, but it has been an absolute pleasure, and really look forward to staying in contact with you all.
And you, thank you so much for coming this evening, and a good way to end your part on. Thank you. Have a good evening. So can I just quickly ask any people who are left on the chat if there's any other questions for our panelists? Or any questions even that the panelists would like to ask each other?
I think we know each other already, but
No, that's
I
great.
think conversations are definitely important. So as long as we keep the conversation, I've just been approached, or our team, David, we've been approached by another group of students who wants to also work on climate neutrality. So I think it's interesting that lots of people who want to do things and perhaps they feel a bit alone. So we also have this difficulty of, it's a big place here. How do we make people connecting to each other or know what the other one's doing? That's another difficulty, which is not technical.
Yeah, no, it's been fantastic this week as part of Green Week to see everybody coming from all corners of the all sorts of places across Coventry and Warwickshire and getting involved in all sorts of things. We've got overall for this week we had 54 or more events. We also had groups of people, mostly on an individual level, I hasten to add, to be COVID compliant, going out and do litter picking across Coventry, and they've grabbed bags and bags worth of litter off our streets and off our parks as well, which has been fantastic. We've got various activities as part of Green Week Plus as well over the rest of the month. Over the next few days, there's still a number of events, including at the weekend. There's also the STEM conference, I believe, on Saturday, which is taking climate change as its core focus, which is fantastic, the Warwick STEM conference. There's also plans already for a Sustainability Careers Day as well in, I believe, April. So lots of things happening around sustainability and really looking to embed sustainability into our day-to-day lives. I think what we've learned throughout this evening is that it doesn't have to be something extra. It's just a case of building it in and it becoming our day-to-day routine, and just part of the social norm. So with that, I want to thank our guest speakers. I want to thank Chris Ennew, Kate, Hannah, Mathilde, Hopi, and Joel, and also obviously our keynote Clover as well, and wish you a good evening, and have a fantastic weekend.
And thank you very much for David and Catherine for organising. It's always a great event.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, great.